Welcome, everyone, to the February 2021 Bible and Beyond discussions. I'm your host, Shirley Paulson, and our presenter this evening is Dr. Hal Tausig. In this study, we'll be talking about Jesus Sophia in the Bible. We're going to try to cover a lot tonight with a quick look at the divine female figure, Wisdom Sophia, in Proverbs, the Book of Wisdom, and Ecclesiasticus, or otherwise known as Sirach. And then we'll find Jesus Sophia in Matthew, Luke, John, and 1 Corinthians. And if time permits, we'll touch on Jesus Sophia in the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, and even the secret revelation of John. It's amazing to think of how many places we can find her. So Hal, thank you. Take it from here.
Thanks so much, Shirley. It's nice to be with you all this evening. And this is not the first time that we have looked at, on Monday nights, at the figure of Wisdom Sophia. And it seemed from our conversation so far that it would be good for us to take a deeper look at her, especially relative to gender and ways that we can think about gender. And to do that, I'm also introducing the figure of Jesus into the conversation so that we can think more complexly about gender in the Bible. But I think the main thing that is important this evening, as every Monday, is for you all to get a chance to think out loud with the rest of us, and for you to ask the questions you need to ask, for you to make objections as much as you can. All of those help us all think a lot better. I think probably the best thing right now for me to do is to see how many of you have some acquaintance with the figure of Wisdom Sophia. And Shirley, maybe you can help me look if people raise their hands, those who have done some study about the figure of Wisdom Sophia.
I see about 5 to 8 hands up, Hal, and it's nice, like Ellie is putting her hand up electronically, which is helpful, and some people are putting your physical hands up. So I'm getting a feel for maybe, looks like maybe almost half of the people.
Okay, that's really helpful. I think that means that we're going to need to begin with Sophia in some basic ways so that our conversations can go further. And as I do that, those of you who have, I'm sure that there are many of you who basically have studied Sophia a lot. Please jump right in. There are many ways to make mistakes in thinking about Sophia, so please jump in. As most of you know that have been here before, I talk for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we have a time for all of us to talk together, and then I jump back in again. So we'll be doing that throughout, and that will give a lot of us a chance to talk. We're now at 40, but I'm sure that a number of us can jump right in. Well, the figure of Wisdom Sophia is a figure that is in the Bible in a whole bunch of places. To one count that I did, I found her about the 6th most known persona in the Bible overall, making that the First and the Second Testament. And so she's very well known, but oddly enough, I think our noting tonight that only half of us have had a chance to think about her shows that actually, in terms of the way churches and the public have thought about the Bible, Sophia, or Wisdom Sophia, has been overlooked or sometimes even intentionally hidden from view. Now, let me say a little bit about the word wisdom and the word Sophia. They're the same thing. When you read your Bibles, you will never find, except in a few translations, you'll never find the word Sophia. But the figure of wisdom throughout both the First Testament and the Second Testament is primarily an actual figure, a person. And she is, therefore, we sometimes when we read wisdom, we think concept. The word wisdom, of course, is a concept, but many places in the Bible, the word wisdom means a divine person. And the reason that we now say wisdom Sophia to deepen the thinking on this is because the word in Greek, the word wisdom in Greek is Sophia. So in other words, in Greek, if you say Sophia, that is simply the naming of the concept or the person of wisdom. So that's why I think it's more clear if we talk about wisdom Sophia, meaning we're talking, at least this evening, about the persona or the person of wisdom. What I do want to say quite clearly in that regard is there's so much of her as a divine person that we're not imagining this. This has, in the last 30 years or more, been very important for many people reading the biblical text to notice that there is this divine female at the heart of the many texts. Probably the majority of the texts that are about her are from the First Testament or the Hebrew Bible. We will look at her also in the New Testament or the Second Testament as well. So I'm going to stop for a moment here to see if some of you want to add a little bit to the subject matter I've had here, and some of you ask a few questions about this character, Wisdom Sophia.
Can you comment on the building, Hagia Sophia, in Istanbul or Constantinople?
Yeah, well, that's basically, a magnificent building and community in Constantinople, and that simply means that church structure is basically in her honor.
So it's a way of honoring her by giving the church that name. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
What I thought was interesting, because you had talked about this one book of the Bible. I think it's called, it is like a Wisdom of Solomon or something like that.
Uh-huh.
And I looked it up, and they were talking about wisdom, and I thought it was an interesting concept. He speaks of her as a flawless mirror. And the Christian writer Origen calls Jesus a flawless mirror.
Yeah.
And that he was a reflection. His works, etc., he was reflecting God. So he was expressing God in everything he was doing, and as a result, he was a flawless mirror. So that's an idea or a concept of it's a feminine concept, but it can be expressed by anybody.
Yes, and we may have time for this. It's quite clear that from the very beginning of Jesus' people, they thought that she and he were very much alike. And in that ancient world, they weren't sort of fussy about whether you were talking about female and male as the same thing. So yes, it's very important to notice how a lot of the early churches, even through the 10th and 11th centuries, people basically combined or put together very much of the figures of Jesus and Sophia Wisdom. Well, let's talk a little bit more about her to get a little bit more familiar. It's interesting, of course, that this is a figure that is divine, and how can we talk about that in a set of religions which think of themselves as monotheistic or something like monotheistic? This is important to notice that Sophia wisdom, or wisdom Sophia, speaks as a fully divine character, but does not eliminate a relationship between her and the great creator. In fact, she also creates, but she often will mention the God that is more powerful than her usually. So one might think of her as somewhat less than the super God, but fully divine. For instance, the Wisdom of Solomon says she can do all things on her own. Yet the Wisdom of Solomon also talks about her in relationship to the Hebrew God. Mainly, what we see is the development of the character of Wisdom Sophia in the later Hebrew or Israelite time. So from perhaps the 4th or 3rd century BCE on, there's a deep devotion to her in the faith and religion of Israel. And there it is important that Sophia means wisdom. That is, she is a divine character, but for her, one of the major ways to know God is to know how to think, to know how to learn, and to know how to be wise. So she is in that regard very related to Greek thought, and this is of course a time in which the people of Israel have, to a certain extent, been conquered by other countries and other empires, including those who speak Greek to one another. So, for instance, the Wisdom of Solomon and the Ben Sirach or Ecclesiasticus, they are written in Greek, but in a Hebrew culture and country, although sometimes that country has been conquered by people that speak Greek in the larger world. Let me read one piece in Ecclesiasticus 6, and this just gives you a sense of how people are really focused on who she is. Put your feet into her fetters and your neck into her harness. Give your shoulder to her yoke. Do not be restive in her reign. Court her with all your soul and with all your might. Keep in her ways. Go after her and seek her. She will reveal herself to you. Once you hold her, do not let her go. For in the end, you will find rest in her, and she will take the form of joy for you. Her fetters, you will find, are a strong defense. Her harness, a robe of honor. Her yoke will be a golden ornament. Her reins, purple ribbons. You will wear her like a robe of honor. You will put her on like a crown of glory.
Can you tell us what translation that it's from, Hal?
From the New Jerusalem Bible.
Thank you.
So let me stop there for a little bit more to see how Wisdom Sophia is sinking in for you for whom she is somewhat new, and those of you who know her better, what some of your thoughts are that will help us get a bigger picture of who she is.
And just one other question, Hal, before we get into that, could you tell us what text that was from?
Yes, that was from the 6th chapter of Ecclesiasticus or Ben Sirach.
Thank you. Okay, great. So I see a hand up with Joy.
Thank you, Hal. I'm beginning to get a feeling from what you're saying that wisdom and the Creator are related somewhat like the Trinity. You know, the Trinity is portrayed as three persons, but in a way they're all interrelated and all one. That's triunity. And so this Sophia is more about the feminine creativity of the creator and not necessarily a hierarchy, like you were saying.
Thanks so much, Joy. That really makes a lot of sense. And what you said just now actually is very important in the development of the Trinity. So actually, the people who developed Trinity used the relationship between Wisdom Sophia and God as a primer for thinking about the Trinity. So for instance, at one point in the 4th century, when certain people were being called heretics of one kind or another around the Trinity, it wasn't clear whether you were on the right side of some kind of orthodox fence. The emperor would call you and would have you read from the book of Proverbs and wisdom. And the emperor would say, who is this that Proverbs is talking about in relationship to God? And let's read that text, because this is one of the most amazing pieces about her. This is Wisdom Sophia talking herself. God created or received me when his purpose first unfolded, before the oldest of his works. From everlasting I was firmly set, and from the beginning, before earth came into being. The deep was not when I was born. There were no springs to gush with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills, I came to birth. I was beside God. I was a master craftsperson, delighting with God day after day, ever at play in God's presence, at play everywhere in his world, delighting to be with the sons of men. Now, back to the emperor. So the emperor reads that about Wisdom Sophia and God creating together. And the emperor then says to the teacher that some people are suspect of, who is that figure, Wisdom Sophia? And if the person answers Jesus, he wins. If he says it's not Jesus, Wisdom Sophia and Jesus are different, then that particular emperor said, wrong belief. I'm not really big on orthodoxy and heresy, but I just wanted to say, Joy, that this shows how actually you were exactly right on, that the relationship between Wisdom Sophia and God is how the Trinitarians started thinking you could have several divine figures in the same reality.
Just one thing, can you tell us where that was also? Was that in the same book?
That's Proverbs 8. Any other comments at this point? What isn't making sense about it? What is strange? What is interesting and exciting?
I'm excited in the fact that she seems to show up in so many different places. Like it's not just one author who thinks of this, but she's all over the place.
Seems to also harken back to John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Yes, and actually that first part of the Gospel of John is clearly taken from wisdom character. So, and I want to just point that out quickly. Towards the middle of the Gospel of John, there's this phrase, the Word became flesh, and he pitched a tent among us, and we saw his glory. So the frame of, and the Word, more or less Jesus, pitched a tent among us is straight out of wisdom literature, because that's what Wisdom Sophia does, is she's with God and she comes to earth and pitches a tent in the temple of Israel. Well, I'm hoping then to talk some more about what we are doing in terms of how we're thinking about God and gender. And there, I'm wanting us to notice that Jesus is divine in much scripture, not all, but in much, and so is Wisdom Sophia divine. And really, for the last 2 generations of our time, one of the big debates has been, what gender is God? And it's been one of the biggest fights in current day Christianity since probably at least the 1970s. And so I'd love us to think about Jesus and Sophia in that regard. For one reason, because in both cases, each of them seemed to be second fiddle to a certain extent. And each of them seemed to be divine. So here, it feels to me as if what happened, so I in the 1980s, I co-wrote 2 books about Wisdom Sophia. And one of the things that was very exciting to so many people, and I wasn't the only one writing books about her at that time, was that here you had a Jewish and a Christian figure who was clearly divine and was female. That was very powerfully exciting and inviting to many people who saw both Judaism and Christianity as to much extent just a lot of male power. On the other hand, when I co-wrote several books about Wisdom Sophia, some of you know I'm among other things, a wisdom clergy person. So my denomination called me and my co-author up on heresy charges for writing about Wisdom Sophia. I was not convicted, and it was rejected that I was a heretic, but it was an interestingly close call, and it was a national debate as to whether one could say clearly, as we had in our book, clearly said that this is a female divinity in Christianity and in Judaism. So Sophia and Jesus were in the first century also divine figures, and to a certain extent, one was female and one was male. And I, for one, in the late 20th century and on, I was very taken by the fact that there was, I as a Christian, and again, I hope all of you are not Christian because it's good for us to go beyond, but I found it very helpful in my spirituality and for many others to have this divine female character as a part of my religious and spiritual practice. And again, that was not everybody's opinion. So let me stop here to see any thoughts or questions you all might have on the mix of Jesus and Sophia in the Bible, and what you think of that.
Hal, this is Janice here.
Janice.
Hi, I'm wondering if you could talk about what Jesus would have learned or what his background was. Like, would he already have read those texts, let's say, that you were reading? Would he know about Sophia? Or because I know in Judaism, there's the Shekhinah is a female presence of God. And if he was comfortable with that, and if the people he was talking to were comfortable with that, then it wouldn't sound strange to their ears, right?
Oh, totally. I feel like I planted you, Janice, as a plug, because
No,
actually,
I promise you did it.
actually, both Matthew and Luke have Jesus teaching about it.
So I'll read one passage from Matthew. For John came, neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he is possessed. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a drunkard and a glutton, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet Sophia is justified by her deeds.
What he's saying is people are criticizing me for what I'm doing and criticizing John the Baptist, and we're both doing the opposite. But both I and John the Baptist are children of Sophia. Now, just to get to your mention of Shekinah, and here we're, of course, mixing our languages because Shekinah is Hebrew and Sophia is Greek. Yes, Shekinah is simply the Hebrew word for glory. And Shekinah in some texts in Hebrew becomes a person too. So
Yeah.
Similar things are going on in both characters, but they're different characters actually. Sophia seems to be much more interested in how learning makes you a friend of God. And Shekinah, how glory and beauty make people friends of God. So they're similar female divinities, probably quite a bit more about Sophia as a character and a person in Hebrew scriptures than Shekinah. But Shekinah is now, for Jewish folks, is much more known than Sophia. Other thoughts about Jesus and Sophia?
The text that you quoted from Matthew,
Yes.
is that wisdom word that's in the Greek, is that in the feminine form, or?
Yes, yeah, it's the regular word, and is by the way, Matthew chapter 11, verse 19. Yes, this is the regular old word, and is used in a phrase that is referring to a person. And then Luke has a very similar phrase and content, but Luke has Jesus say, and wisdom is justified by her children.
So would you say the feminine presence of God is very subtly woven into the Bible, Old and New Testament?
Yes, for sure. And I want to talk some more about that as well a little bit later. But yes, I think that's quite clear in a number of ways, especially the way in the last 50 years, New Testament scholars have really come to see how much women's leadership is happening in the early communities. It's funny that prior to the late 20th century, the churches were making people read only from the post-Pauline letters, which were very anti-feminine. What has happened since then is a lot of scholars are saying, for instance, Paul, in basically every letter, Paul salutes women leaders and names them. That the post-Pauline letters, that like Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy, that they are very against women's leadership is a later development. But interestingly enough, churches really had people reading much more 1st Timothy than Galatians, because Galatians has in the first chapter, 1 Corinthians, has a direct naming of one of the main women leaders. Her name is Chloe. And so, yeah, there's no way around that now. But there certainly was, for a lot of Christianity, a lot of ways to ignore or invert the presence of a gendered God of a feminine character, right alongside and maybe in the middle of Jesus himself.
So Hal, I just want to make sure that we're also clear that you're distinguishing between Paul's writing in Galatians, but not Paul in 1 Timothy, right?
Right, yes. Most scholars think that 1st and 2nd Timothy were not written by the historical Paul, but for instance, 1 Corinthians and Galatians and Philippians were, as examples.
So I understand, I guess the scholarship of the last 50 years has also changed the view on Mary Magdalene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's gone from a bad person to a good person somehow.
Yeah. Well,
very simply.
Yeah, for sure. And what just 2 months ago we studied the Gospel of Mary. It was probably the character of Mary Magdalene, and that's one of the main underpinnings of how all of this, simply the patriarchy of the church, kept us away from both that kind of material in the canon and outside the canon.
Could I just make a little point here that Richard, that and everybody, that all of our events have been archived on the Early Christian Text website and on the Early Christian Text YouTube channel. All of these conversations are still there.
I'd like to then stay with this question of gender and just talk a little bit more about Jesus and Sophia. As I've said before, I have been so moved spiritually and intellectually by the figure of Sophia, and especially the way when Wisdom Sophia came back into the lives of people in the last 30 or 40 years, how that really gave us a new frame of reference for how we can think about our own relationship to the divine. But I have to say, in the last 15 years, I find myself increasingly noticing that my earlier belief that Christianity had access to female, feminine divinity missed some of what the comparisons between divine Jesus and divine Sophia were saying in these texts. I think I was too much under the sway of the intense and charged modern male-female fights. Now, as I reread the comparisons of divine Sophia and divine Jesus in the first 2 centuries of the Christ peoples, I see these texts not so much in a contestation between female and male, but more an invitation to a wider range of engenderedness. Both Sophia and Jesus are divine realities in these texts in somewhat different and similar ways. They are both inviting people into a larger range of genders, larger than male or female. Nor are they trying to make, nor are these texts trying to make some ideal combination of male and female together. Rather, I tend to see these canonical and extra-canonical texts that they're going into a fuller set of divinities, much larger, more complex, and for me, far more interesting than the binary of male and female. Jesus is far from the ideal male divinity. He is much more a fascinating, playful mix of strength, vulnerability, unfinished process, occasional perfection, love, anger, beauty, loneliness, and openness. His aliveness is multivalent, childlike, and humorous. In the first 2 centuries of documents, it is not possible to pigeonhole him as archetypal male, whatever that might mean.
For those comfortable enough to consider his open-ended identity in our day, it has been almost as easy to see him in female, feminine terms. But his flexible and fluid character does not really work as just male or female, nor as some steady androgen. He is just too divine and human in a variety of directions. It is true that in later highly Christian creeds, he became a mighty authoritarian male divinity, but that took quite a bit of time to pull off.
The same is true for Sophia. In classic Proverbs 8 passage that we just read, her primary identity is playful, and her relationship to the high creating sort of male divinity does not work in primarily male-female terms. That text is too bouncy and multivalent, ranging wildly between a young divine daughter, a real workman-like creator, and an almost mother. In other documents, Sophia is wildly angry and almost an authoritarian bad father. And then in the New Testament, those passages about Sophia play gently and humorously with her identity as the original Jesus or some kind of multi-gendered sibling. So for a while, I suspect that we can let go of the idea that male and female are the only gender options. Even with Sophia and Jesus, we can relax into a kind of gendered queer plurality for God, Jesus, Sophia, and our own participation in divinity. It seems likely to me that in the coming decades, Jesus and Sophia will also unfold into a larger range of playful genderness. So just to let you hear my longer trajectory, I'm still really happy to have Sophia as the surprising feminine female presence that came out of nowhere for us after such a long time of absence. But for me, I'm also wanting to think that what happened to us in the 1970s through 1990s, in the intense male-female debate, missed some of the multi-genderedness of both Sophia and Jesus. So just then to get that into the mix, see whether there are comments or interests in that.
We do have a couple of hands up. I think Mark's hand is up first. Mark, you want to go ahead?
Thank you so much, Dr. Telsig. I was fascinated by you using non-binary in such an ancient context. To me, it's a fairly 21st century term. And as a person born in the 1950s, felt like I got used to homosexuality in the 70s as not just a problem, but at first a legitimate choice, and then, of course, now a legitimate discovery of your sexuality, often in adolescence. With transgender and your term non-binary, I think I'm having a harder time than I did in the 70s believing that it's a healthy solution to identity issues more complex and unique and individual and overdetermined. But I'd be fascinated by historic evidence that there were non-binary conceptualizations in play in the first century?
Ooh, you also, did I pay you to ask that question?
It would have been more succinct if you had.
Oh, Mark, you're so great. Thank you so much. Just two non-binary people in the New Testament that one can mention. The first is Paul, and Paul is, infamous in Corinthians in some case for trying to tone the women down, the women that actually he taught to be uppity. But for me, a little bit masculinely authoritative in some of those places. But one of the interesting things that we've been noticing about Paul is that he, in so many of his letters, he talks about being humiliated and talks about being beaten and talks about being in prison. And no author of that day does that. He basically,
they don't sacrifice any authority to
they
that.
don't. Yeah, no, that's what it is to be a man. And Paul, all over the place, talks about how he has been humiliated, and he makes it both implicitly and explicitly. He makes that a parallel to the experience of Jesus himself. In other words, Jesus also is known primarily first for his own humiliation. So that is a much more than binary figure. Is one. The second one, and Mark, you and I have talked a little bit about this, or at least outside of the canon, there's this very popular figure now from Nag Hammadi, the Thunder Perfect Mind. And there's this great I am figure who is at first primarily female, but she mixes herself up with the humiliated female and the first and the last female. And then she becomes also basically trans in her identity, as she claims sometimes maleness too. So the Thunder Perfect Mind has been claimed by a lot of artists as an intensely non-binary character. So those are two possibilities.
And when you started to mention Paul as non-binary,
yeah,
I thought you might be talking about the person rather than the writings. Any speculation on the thorn in his side?
Yeah, there you are.
His orientations?
Yeah, that's been written about quite nicely by a number of theologians in the last 20 years. So I don't think we'll ever know for sure, but it feels to me like Paul really opens himself up to a whole bunch of pain, loss, and brilliance. And that just makes for a very non-binary person.
Hal, I want to mention to you that Vaughn Bell has her hand up also.
I just wondered if you thought that as the church began to lose or suppress the idea of Sophia, if that contributed to the rise of Mariology as kind of another way to find the feminine.
It certainly Catholic been loving Sophia a lot more than Protestants for a long time. So, for instance, when I wrote our first book on Sophia in the 1980s, all of a sudden there was a fully ordained group of nuns, Catholic nuns, who were named the Daughters of Wisdom. And their group of nuns had been commended by the Pope as far as the early 1800s. So yeah, it is true that has loosened the patriarchalness of the church for quite a long time.
Thank you.
I want to mention to you that Ellie had to leave, but she left a little comment in the chat that I think is worth people reading. Maybe I should just read it really quickly because it's very short.
Please.
Yes, she said, I have to exit for another event, but I've done a lot of work on the Gali, eunuchs of the mother of the gods, who were definitely a social location for non-binary people. They castrated themselves to serve her. Matthew 19:10-12 extols eunuchs more generally too. There are many other non-binary identities in the Greco-Roman world as well.
Yeah, exactly. So Mark, welcome to this crowd. It's really fun to, it's really all over the place. Other questions or challenges?
Yeah, I've in my study of the Hebrew names for God, El Shaddai, is a feminine description of God, meaning, the nurturer or the giant breast. But it also means the destroyer. So it has both meanings of this incredibly mothering, beautiful feminine presence, but also reminds me of the woman in the apocalypse, this amazing monster of a woman who can do anything. So that's really even older, right? The El Shaddai in the First Testament. So that's an image of God that is lost in the English.
Right, exactly. Well, Hebrew women warriors go way back.
And Judith Scott has her hand up.
Sophia plays a very big part in Orthodox worship. Before the gospel is read, it's held up and the priest calls on Sophia or wisdom, stand alive. So it's called on for the gospel reading. And also there are icons of Sophia. I can send one along later, where she's enthroned and has all this gold. And I think it's taken from Revelation, but I'm not sure. But there is definitely a Sophia icon and a call on recognition of Sophia wisdom.
Thank you so much, Judith. Well, so just for me to notice how relaxing a little bit with multivalent figures, both Jesus and Sophia are really good at that, in kind of making fun and being playful. So the way that Sophia in chapter 8 of Proverbs, the way she creates with God is by playing. And that playfulness of our character is very much the way Jesus himself taught. The parables are often hidden to flat out good jokes.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for your participation, and thank you, Hal, especially for your another eye-opening discussion. We have plenty to think about for sure. This was the February 2021 Bible and Beyond discussion on Sophia, Jesus in the Bible, led by Dr. Hal Tausig. Once a month at 8 to 9 o'clock Eastern Time on Monday nights, generally the 4th of the month, we provide a discussion of one or more of these early Christian texts. Dr. Tausig leads these discussions, sharing a well-framed overview of the particular text and allowing participants time to ask questions and share their insights. Donations supporting the creation of these textual study archives are greatly appreciated. You can find a donate button on the Early Christian Text website. Thanks so much, everybody, for being with us. It's great fun. We hope to see you next month.